Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel, and welcome to a very important message. Car maintenance, folks. Today we have a 2017 Lexus NX200t, or rather a victim of car maintenance neglect. This beautiful car had 66,000 miles, and it comes to the shop with a very interesting problem at a very early age. It is burning so much oil and it's making all kinds of engine knocking and everything. Let's start the video, we'll talk about it, and we're actually going to fix it in this video as well. So here is the story of this Lexus. This is an 8AR FTS engine. It's a 2-liter. It's a turbocharged engine. Pretty low-key engine. Doesn't really have a lot of issues. Yes, it is turbocharged, so maintenance is very important, right? Except we have reason to believe that the original owner of this beautiful 200T did not change the oil on this engine since the car was new until 46,000 miles. And then they started, of course, having problems with the turbo and oil burning. Brought it to a dealership. Dealership told me you need a new turbo and your warranty is void, by the way. And what did they do after that? Did they fix the car? Actually, they just drove it as it is for a while, and then they just traded it in. Didn't say nothing here. Let's just trade it in, let's move on. And then the current owner of the car just bought the car. And they bought it as is, didn't buy an extended warranty. I mean, it's a Lexus, right? Well, this car burns so much oil, and the engine sounds like this. I hope it is clear in the video that that engine does not sound healthy at all. And we already looked at this car, but I want to show you what we actually found. How does it look from the outside? Because there is a very important thing about car diagnosis before we dig into an engine. You have to find the what's wrong, but the more important than that is the why. Because if you don't find the why, we could fix this engine or put another engine here, and we could be arriving at the exact same thing shortly after if we don't know the why. Now, in the particular case of this engine, the why is you might have neglected that oil change a little, way too much. 46,000 miles documented. So actually diagnosing this car is very interesting because I know what the damage is. I'm going to show you here in a second, but the why, we had to dig into paperwork and service history and kind of reading the dealership notes across when the car came in for the first time. Let us first show you the extent of the damage on this engine, which is just sad. Folks, take care of your cars. I'd rather do an oil change on this than change an engine at 66,000 miles. That's kind of sad. Let us pull the spark plugs. We'll do a boroscope, and actually after that, we're going to pull this engine out of this car, tear it down, show you the extent of the damage of what happens when you take a really good engine and neglect it. And then we're going to put a used engine in this car. We'll talk about it throughout, get it running, and get it back to the customer. So when we got this car, I was kind of skeptical about what exactly is going on with this car. Like, this is way too early for oil burning and everything. But I did not anticipate the surprise that we were going to find with this car. Let's pull the spark plugs. We'll take a look. Take a look at some of the carnage here, because it doesn't look pretty, I'll tell you that much, but I wanted you to see it. Oh, I wanted you to see this plug. This is not an original plug on this car. It's an NGK, and it's a little too dark for a plug that potentially just got replaced. Let's remove the rest of them. This one is the same thing. This one is probably the worst one. Oh, oh, God help us all. That does not look like a plug from a 60,000 mile car, 66,000. Just look at the porcelain, how it's broken, completely broken. I even wonder if these plugs are counterfeit. Who knows? Let's look inside the engine and you'll see. So we pulled the ugly duckling spark plug out of cylinder number 4. I'll put the input from this camera just for you to see what things look like. So here's the piston. You notice that slight wash on this side, a little bit more on the other side. I'll point it with an arrow. When you see that, this engine's burning oil. How much? That's a different question. But I'd like you to look at the cylinder wall. First, let's for reference establish that this is somewhat, it has scratches, but you can see the crosshatch through it. Now, when we turn the camera and you see this, that is complete destruction. Do you see that? This, one of these days used to look like this. That is unbelievable what happened here. I mean, even with this much neglect, it doesn't look terrible actually. 46,000 miles without an oil change from new, mind you. And this cylinder is completely gone. Now, this is the important part of this. We figured out what happened. We have cylinder wall damage. Of course, this is going to just, nothing will seal, we'll have low compression. But in addition to that, we do have knocking noises from the engine. I suspect actually the turbo is making some of these knocking noises, and we won't know until we tear it apart and kind of be able to access the impeller and see if we have movement or not. But the biggest thing is the why. And the why, you couldn't figure it out from the car. I mean, even taking the oil cap, you look, I mean, it's really impossible to tell. There's a little bit of moisture here on the cap. This moisture is not a huge deal, but I noticed this. Like you have definite sludge on the edge here. I hope you can see it clearly. This is way too early for this engine to have this much at the top, and we literally just drove it from the other side of the building to here. It's not even warmed up, and it's already has blow by. Bottom line is, long story short, this motor is done. I mean, there's nothing you can do for that cylinder wall. And by the time we actually already looked at this car and discussed it with the customer, options are we either get a new short block, but then that knocking noise is kind of concerning, because I don't know if unless we take it apart and tear it down to see, do we have cam damage? Do we have lifter damage? This is a VVTi engine. Do we have gear damage? Do we have chain damage? I mean, this could just end up being a whole engine replacement. Because these cars are newer and they're not really known for problems, a used engine is actually not an expensive proposition. And that's where we're actually going to end up going here. We took our time to kind of select an engine. We actually got an engine with super low miles, and I really like it. It seems very healthy. We looked inside of it, looked around it. I like it. We researched the service history on that engine. And we also got a used turbo, because the turbo on these, yeah, it's not cheap from Lexus. And they don't have a lot of issues. If you neglect them or have extreme high miles, yes, but normally they're fine. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put these spark plugs off camera just so we can drive the car. Don't want to push it. Let's pull this engine out, let's tear it down and actually see the complete extent of the damage. Because right now I know this is non-salvageable because I see the cylinder wall damage. But aren't you just curious what happens when you don't change the oil this long in a Lexus engine? What other damage will we find? Let's get to work. Come on, Jose, let's pull this engine out. Grab it from the other side, let's go. Yeah, I wish it was that simple, right? Let's stop the sad stuff and let's grab some popcorn, some coffee, your favorite snack, and let's talk about this one. The Lexus NX, the first generation, doesn't get a lot of talk in our channel, and let's change that. In case you own one of these cars and your blood pressure is going up right now, I would like it to very calmly come down and remain down. Because I own a shop, in case you haven't followed my channel and you don't know what we do in our shop. I own a shop specializing in Toyota and Lexus. That's all we work on. We do everything from basic maintenance all the way to major restorations and work like this one, for example. The Lexus 200t, specifically the NX200t, is one of the cars that rarely come in for problems. I mean, they 90% of the times they'll come for maintenance. That's all. I mean, I have only seen one singular case in my shop that came in with actual engine problems, and that thing had over 200,000 miles. It was an Uber car, and at that point the owner was like, well, I've really got my use out of this car. They moved on. It was burning oil and whatnot, and we even suspected bad maintenance. But the Lexus NX in its first generation really came with two models. It was the 200t, which is like this one, and then there was the 300h, or the hybrid model. The hybrid model had a similar engine to RAV4 hybrid, Camry hybrid of that generation. It had a 2AR engine, a 2.5. Pretty decent engine if you take care of it. But this particular engine is a very special engine. See, this engine came from 2015 to 21 in the NX. It came in a few other models, but in the NX, Lexus did something very interesting. I feel like it was an experimental model. So the Lexus NX is heavily based on the RAV4 platform. It is basically a RAV4. So from 2015 2017, it was called an NX200t. T indicating that it's a turbo, 200 being a 2-liter engine. Then in 2018 to 21, they changed it to NX300 because they felt like that sounded a lot better. Now, full disclaimer on this engine, I have not exactly been inside one of these engines because they are pretty reliable. I mean, you don't have much. They do require maintenance, and there are a few things we'll talk about here. But even being a turbo engine, they don't have a lot of issues. Yes, I have seen cases of turbos having issues from lack of maintenance, but remember, lack of maintenance. You don't maintain these cars, things are gonna go. And the turbo from this car is a very high quality turbo, and I have to say that because this engine has its quirks, but it doesn't have actual issues that are known and rampant. Not really for such a heavily modified engine. And I say modified because this is an AR series engine. Same thing as the 1AR, the 2AR, which are decent engines if you take care of them. If you don't, they love to burn oil. But other than that, they don't have much issues. In the early iterations, they did have some issues with VVTi gear rattles and whatnot, but not really much else. But something about this engine that is very interesting, that if you own one of these cars, or you're considering one, or you're just curious about them, this is a highly experimental engine. And the Lexus NX was kind of a surprise. Actually a very nice car. They're only made in Japan, and that was kind of a plus for them. So this engine is kind of a hybrid between the AR series engine, which is in 2024, it is a kind of an old school engine now, and the modern stuff that you're seeing today. You know, the V35, the new 4-cylinder, the T24. These are the new engines that you're seeing today in 2024 being put in everything, and everybody is really uproared about the turbos, and oh my God, this is the end of Toyota Lexus reliability. But did you know that this engine was actually the first iteration of that? It was the first Lexus turbo engine that they put in a pretty mainstream model. And I think the NX did pretty well. It's everybody that owns it really love them because they're simple, humble, and it's basically a nice RAV4. Here's something about this engine that is very interesting. See, the block design is exactly, almost very similar to the 2AR, same construction, same balance shaft, same everything. But the cylinder head is a cylinder head from a much more modern engine, and that's where the complication is. See, this is one of the early engines with D4S, and the good D4S. D4S is direct and port injection at the same time. Yes, they had in some other Lexus models, but this was the version that stayed with us till 24. And then the cylinder head, the valve springs are a very unique shape where they're thinner at the top, thicker in the middle, very similar to like an A25A, which is a much more modern engine's valve springs. and then the overall design of the cylinder head. Now, it doesn't have the laser clad and kind of the dynamic force, unique shape of the tumble flow. That's the only thing it doesn't have, but it has everything else that the newer engines have. And that was the cool thing. It does have a plastic valve cover. It was actually one of the first ones. Then we had the 2G RFKS that had a plastic valve cover as well. Very high quality engine. I mean, the build quality of this engine is very impressive. So here's the thing with this engine. This was actually the turbo side of this engine. It is a vacuum controlled wastegate, which is a very old school way, but it's actually a very reliable way because you're using vacuum. There's nothing complicated about it. But it actually used a liquid to air intercooler back in 2015. That is pretty cutting edge. Extremely cutting edge. The only problem is that liquid to air intercooler sits on the intake manifold and it's all the way in the back, and because of that they had to move the alternator in such a difficult position. You almost can see it in this shot. It sits all the way in the back and it's such a difficult position. I think they were experimenting with this engine, and I think it was a successful experimentation because they are reliable. Now, talk to me about cleaning a throttle body on one of these engines. You almost have to outright pull the engine out of the car to do that. It's very difficult, and it's a very tight spot because it sits on the liquid to air intercooler, and then there's a little pipe, and it's such a tight space behind the engine. It's almost impossible to get to it. Very complicated cooling system because this has two cooling systems. One of them is for the intercooler itself. One of them is for the engine itself. It's a little bit of a complicated engine bay here. But the interesting thing is there's a lot of experimentation with this engine. It had a vacuum pump, and then the PCV hoses that sit right on the valve cover, they actually have a one-time use clamp, which is very interesting to see. And the turbo being in the front, usually every turbo car, when the turbo sits in the front, that's the place you want it to be. It's the easy spot to access. This turbo takes you no more than, I don't know, half an hour to take it out of the car. It's very simple to remove it, and it has the integrated exhaust manifold in it, so it makes it even easier. It's actually, as I dig into this car further and further, I haven't really taken an engine out of it. We worked on a 200T, but not take an engine like this. It initially looks super complicated when you look at it, but actually digging into it, things are not as complicated as they seem. And that was the thing. The only thing was the alternator is a very bad spot. There is no other way to say it. It's not a good spot. It's all the way in the back, right near the axle. It's not a great spot. Having said that, I want to tell you a few things about this particular engine, the 8AR. It was used in other models, but there are a couple of things that people always dislike about it. The first thing is it uses premium fuel. Remember, they were experimenting with turbo engines at this point, so they require you to put premium fuel. That was the thing that was, as we now roll into 24 and you have more turbo engines with Toyota and Lexus, they are not using premium fuel in all of them, and that has to do with technology. That technology was not up there in those times of the 200T. The other thing is, because it is a turbo engine and because they were experimenting, they kind of went the typical Toyota Lexus super conservative ways, and the spark plugs are due for replacement at 40,000 miles. I think this is, other than when we used to use platinum spark plugs in Toyotas and the 30,000 mile plugs, this is the shortest interval in modern engines for Toyota Lexus. The shortest one, which follows, is going to be the 60,000 miles on the 2G RFKS. Almost everything else is Iridium, and 120,000 on the spark plugs. These are the two things that make owners really dislike these. But let me tell you one thing about this. Replacing the spark plugs on this engine is a 15-minute job. They're right there. They're super simple. You just saw me remove them at the beginning of this video. Super DIY friendly, super simple. Now, the only thing service-wise that is extremely complicated and just very frustrating with this engine is bleeding the engine coolant. I mean, they have two bleeders. I feel like this is what I say, it's an experimental powertrain. Successful, but there are the quirks. So bleeding the engine coolant is a very complicated proposition because you have two bleeders, and if you follow the instructions in the book, you follow the manual to the T, you will still have issues with this, because you have to put a hose. You kind of have to deviate from the instructions to bleed it properly, otherwise it'll overheat and you'll have issues. You have to put a hose on the bleeder in the front, run it to a container, run the engine at high RPM until you get continuous flow. It's a little bit of a complicated, cumbersome process. Same thing with the turbo circuit coolant replacement. You have to run the pump using a scan tool, otherwise you could damage it. And that's the other thing. Now here is the truth about this job. After talking with the owner, they bought this car with the understanding that it's as is, and they didn't anticipate that it was gonna have this many problems, this major of a problem, but they were going into it thinking maybe we will need to do some stuff. I believe they replaced brakes or tires or something like that, but when the engine started burning oil, that's when the real problems started, and they were severely concerned. So they were adding anywhere from 2 to 3 quarts in 1,000 miles. That is just as an extreme number, folks. Let's establish something with engines so you would know this. If your engine burns in 1,000 miles, it burns a quart or less, you are okay. This is not an extreme rate of consumption. You're not going to start fouling plugs. You're not going to start severely diluting this oil. You're not going to start damaging your catalytic converter, because that's another thing that gets damaged with oil consumption. But when we start seeing consumption rates over a quart in 1,000 miles, we get into a quart and a half, 2 quarts, 3 quarts in 1,000 miles. That's when this is too excessive. Anything over 2, 3 quarts, you're going to start fouling plugs. You're going to start getting misfires because the plugs are fouled, or you simply start losing compression. The only thing is, running a compression test on an engine that is burning this much oil, that oil sitting in the cylinder could give you false readings. And that is, if you remember the old times, the kind of the basics of compression test, if you have low compression and you add oil and the compression goes back up, you have bad rings. That is kind of the old school way of doing compression. Well, if you have so much oil in that cylinder, it's going to do the same thing and you're going to get a false reading. So there is a thing with compression tests with these. Now, the AR series engine unfortunately suffers from this. They are such tight tolerance. I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit toward the end of the video when we show you the inside of this engine, but there's such tight tolerance that if you have a little bit of seizing of the piston rings, you're going to start destroying the cylinder wall slowly. You're going to start wearing into it, and it doesn't take much for it to start burning oil. So maintenance is key, and this is a turbo engine. Oh my God, you neglect the oil changes on a turbo engine, we will have severe issues. Now, let me walk you through what I am seeing as we go. I mean, 50% of this job is just a typical RAV4 engine. I have done a lot of RAV4 engines over my career with Toyota and now in the shop. It usually takes me an hour to an hour and a half to pull a RAV4 4-cylinder AR engine out of it. It's super simple, looks very complicated, but it's super simple. These cars are basic. But this took a long time because there's a series of decisions. The first one being, do we pull the engine with the transmission in the car just from the top, or do we drop the powertrain complete, engine, transmission, subframe, everything down? Now the book wants you to the book will want you to pull it out of the bottom, but in a RAV4 you can pull it out of the top. There's a lot of space. But this one, it was kind of a concern. At some point I had to stop filming it. I'm like, should we change direction and pull the whole powertrain? Because there isn't really much data, because there isn't much 200Ts with blown engines. That's just the reality of things. So at some point I started looking, as we took apart more components, I thought we had enough space. And thankfully I was right about that. It was a good call. So you will see that engine come out here, not too far from here, but at this point, you know, the shop is going on. We're trying to film this. So let me, as we roll close, we're getting closer and closer to day 2 and my haircut. Let us talk about the costs of this job. So Labor is 21 hours. This is a pretty, I was surprised actually by the labor time when we pulled it, but I did not deviate from it much because we haven't done this a lot. The used engine with a 12-month, 12,000-mile warranty with labor, because this is the other thing, you can't just warranty the part, what about labor? So this covers both of them from the company we use for used engines and whatnot. That came up to just over $3,000. That is actually a pretty good price, if you ask me, in 2024 for used engines. Go price an engine for example, a 4Runner, a Tacoma with an old school 1GR. They are a lot more than that. Yes, it's a V6, but you're talking about triple that sometimes. So with this job, we needed some coolant, we needed some oil, we needed a drain plug, filter, and then the biggest thing was a used turbo. Even though the actual turbo I pulled out of this car in the end, I thought it's been replaced at some point. I don't think it was the original one, but it was so questionable. We were not going to do all this and leave that turbo and kind of experiment. I got them a used turbo. That turbo was $771. Not too bad considering the brand new one is $3,000. That would have completely taken this bill out of proportion. So as we watch the engine come out here, the total bill for this was just over $7,100. It's a lot, but remember, this is a much newer car that has a lot of value in it. So this is what made the owners decide, let's fix it, move on, doesn't have a lot of miles, and otherwise doesn't really need anything else. So pulling the engine, this was a very, very nervous moment for me, because even though I think we had enough space, but still we're kind of deviating from the manual here in the sake of not tearing this car completely apart. But in the end, I have good news to report to you. If you have a new 200T or a 300 with this 8AR engine and you are nervous about, do we pull the whole powertrain or we just pull the engine? You can definitely pull the engine out, and it was actually not hard at all. It was hard to pull the million things around it, but once you got it out, it was actually not bad. It was just like any other four-cylinder in a Toyota. It is very similar to a RAV4 pull, but it does take some time. Again, I do this for a living, so when I say it's easy, it's not a DIY job per se, but for a professional technician, yes, it is doable. It is not hard, and I think the labor in the end came out about fair for me in my shop and my time invested in working on this, and fair for the customer that we're not overcharging. So overall, I think things were going very well. We did not have any casualties. Everything was going extremely smoothly. Here's the engine coming out. I'm gonna leave you to watch this. This is always a happy moment, nervous moment for me, but happy moment. And let us check it out live and we'll go from there. We have the engine out of this NX200t. I don't know what kind of surprises we're going to find inside. I know the cylinder wall will be damaged, completely damaged, but this engine made a lot of racket. Let us completely tear it down and let's see the extent of the damage on this one, because this is a complete paperweight right now. Honestly, I wouldn't use a single part out of it, maybe some of the hose clamps and whatnot, but it's a complete paperweight because this engine ran low on oil, was severely neglected. I mean, I wouldn't trust a single part out of it, just heads up. With that comes a small disclaimer. The way I'm going to take this engine apart, you should never take an engine apart like this using impacts and just not caring about anything, but to me, this is just scrap value in metal. And we have some plastic, so there's going to even be less. Let's tear it down and see how bad the damage is. So this was a very happy moment for me. I always wanted to go inside one of these 8ARs because they were always very interesting to me. It was just a really experimental engine. Very interesting valve cover design, because it's kind of, the VVTi setup in this is very interesting. Half of it is new school, half of it is old school. You have that solenoid at the top and then the valve in the front. It's very interesting setup. It's kind of a cross between old school, new school. Super tiny intake manifold. It doesn't really have long short runner. It has them, but they're very small. And the gasket is actually unique, and it has that big baffle in the back. There's a lot of experimentation with this engine, folks. And these are actually the direct injectors that right underneath the intake manifold. Near impossible to access them in the car. That's the only downside to them. But very, very interesting engine, this. So the front cover looks very similar to the 2AR, but notice that VVTi solenoid there. That's a new modern thing. In 2015, we didn't have many engines like that until the 2AR FKS came out. Very interesting engine. That's the one thing I'll say. Another thing I want to mention about this, I didn't mention it earlier. Water pumps are somewhat common on this engine. Very difficult to do in the car. That is one thing I have to say. And the guides, these are modern guides, but the bottom half is old school. And this is what I mean by this is an experimental engine, because the VVTi gears, one of them is old school, one of them is actually new design that they use today. And this was the fascinating part with this, is that half the parts were stuff we see in newer engines, like almost the entire half the design of the cylinder head is from the old school, half is the new stuff, and then the valve springs themselves are new stuff. And this is what's super cool about this engine, is that every engine you see today started with this. And that's the interesting part. I feel like they tested things with this engine. It was a pretty successful test, because this engine, I know it's saying that we're tearing one apart because it's just a paperweight is ironic, but this was severely neglected, folks. Let's go check it out. Here are these valve springs that I was telling you about earlier. Let's go check this engine out, and you'll see the extent of the damage, because it is very severe. Let's take a look at the engine at this point. We had a little incident. I'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's look at what we were looking at when we started the video. Inside the bore. I mean, just look at this. You can absolutely feel it with your fingernails. Look at this. That is completely gone. And the same thing on the other side. Let's take a look at another cylinder. This one is not so bad, but the crosshatch is completely gone. And let's look at the middle cylinders. This one, crosshatch completely gone. Actually feel that. This one, not super bad, but still, it's. But I think the worst one is this one, number 4. This is the one we looked at with the camera. I want to show you what this piston does. First, let's talk some basics. A human hair is 1/1000th of an inch, give or take, about 1/1000th of an inch, just to give you a reference. So these engines, they have a spec. The bore where this piston goes and the piston itself, there has to be a little bit of a clearance. They actually call it oil clearance, but to allow for this piston to expand and contract, and so you can have room for the rings to work. If you put it the same diameter, it's just going to lock up and we're done. That clearance is between 1/1000th of an inch to 2/1000th of an inch on a new engine. That is basically either one human hair distance space between the piston and the bore, or 2 human hairs. Maximum is 4/1000th of an inch, or actually under. It's 0.00394. Just to give you a reference how critical this is. This is the discard point. If you have clearance over that, discard the part that is causing that clearance to be high. From experience, it's usually one causing the other. Usually the piston rings got seized, chewed up the block is no longer round, and we're done. These blocks are not machinable. Now let me show you how much clearance we actually have on this one. It's hilarious. Folks, it's not funny for the current owner. I do have to apologize, but it's just like, don't do this. Well, we'll talk about this in a little bit. Let's just see this. Do you think this is 2 human hairs of clearance? That is not. That is not. And then this one. Let's check the others. That is not. This one is. This is maybe just guesstimating working on engines. This movement could be close. Do you see how little this is moving side to side? This could be close to the maximum spec. Close, but I still think it's over. But this is not. I can guarantee you one thing, it is not. And I noticed that. Let's see if it does it. Occasionally you turn this engine. Hear that? Watch the pistons. They're not supposed to do this. Hear that? Yeah, this engine is done. So, here's the first question you're going to ask. You know, you saw us tear this engine down and everything, and folks are anticipating when a car hadn't had an oil change in 46,000 miles, it's going to be completely covered in sludge. Welcome to 2024, folks. That actually doesn't happen that way all the time. Keep doing this for a long time, and you're going to have that sludge that everybody watches videos, YouTube shorts, or whatnot. Oh, look at this giant amount of sludge. It's not going to happen in one time. It's going to happen repeated abuse. This engine, however, being how tight tolerance it is, the high compression that it is, and turbocharged, it just let go. It's not going to take it. It started burning oil, and these rings seized up. They started chewing the block. I mean, this is what this block could be used for right now, just to give you a reference. This area, it feels like a sandpaper. I can cut this up, use it as a sandpaper. That's the only thing it's useful for. This entire thing is just, it's junk, basically. That's what happens, folks. And let's take a look at the cylinder head here. Do you notice how disgusting? Don't mind this. This is this debris. We're going to talk about it in a second. This is not caused by the engine. But let's look at this area. You notice it's not super dirty. And that's what you're going to see in modern engines, folks. These engines have great filtration systems. They're really efficient. And the modern oils, they really work at not building these giant globs of sludge everywhere. Plus, this engine ran 46,000 miles with the original oil. So many folks will ask, although all the information that we've been able to obtain suggests that from the factory, Toyota uses the bottled oil that they sell. That's what they fill their new cars with. However, certain additives sometimes, some engines, they will add to them from the factory to help with the initial wear. Not a chemist, we're not going to get into them, but that's usually what you put in a new engine. And I think that's what helped this engine not get disgusting, where you have globs of sludge everywhere. But for an engine that has 66,000 miles, this is really not good. This is terrible. You already have varnish buildup. I mean, this should look brand new at 66,000 miles. And it absolutely does not. It has a lot of varnish buildup, like you look here, especially in this area. It just looks very ugly. Now let's flip the cylinder head. Don't worry about this stuff falling. Look at this cylinder. That's the cylinder that was the worst one we looked at. See how dark that is? That's what's going on. You got to read them cylinders, folks. These are closer to normal, actually. You do have a little bit of carbon buildup. These two, not so much. This one absolutely does. This one, though, this was getting a lot of oil because it turns like this on a new engine. Remember, We're not looking at a 1955 Chevy engine here. This is a very modern engine. This is a super high-tech engine, and it's from a modern car that's not very old, and it's completely trashed. It's very sad that we're actually taking this apart, and all this is just worth 20 bucks, in, if that, in scrap value. I would not trust any of these components to go back. I want you to look at one thing. It's going to be very hard to show it on camera. Knowing Toyota engines, if you look at the cams from a certain angle, like especially here, I don't know if it's going to show on camera or not. I hope it does. They're actually blued. That is really not good. Well, I'll just say that. And if you look at some of them, like this one right here, this spot, and these lines, that's actually wear on the cams. Folks, let me tell you one thing. I'm going to link a video right here where I took an engine that has 300,000 miles on it. It's a 2AZ, it was burning oil, but the owner never let it run low. Those engines had an issue from the factory. We reused the cams that had 300,000 miles because they measured fine, they had no wear, bores were good, everything looks good. It's like, why are we replacing it if everything is within spec? This one, I would not put this on a lawnmower, this camshaft, because it's done. You got this much wear in 66,000 miles. That's the problem. We're gonna park this video right here because obviously there's no point in tearing it down. Look at bearings, obviously they're destroyed. I mean, when you got this, everything else is kind of history. But I want to talk to you about two things, takeaways from this video. The first most important thing is do 10,000 mile oil changes, Toyota and Lexus owners with bad driving habits. We're going over that year. We're driving at short distance, driving in cold weather and all this stuff. This is in the future. This is going to happen because you're not following the proper procedure that the manufacturer told you. They're telling you in the manual, if you do certain driving conditions, you cannot do the 10,000 mile oil change. You actually should do 5,000 miles, 6 months. And 90% of people will fall in that category. Now, if you're the kind of people, like I have a few customers that drive their couriers, they're going to put 8,000 miles in a couple weeks. Well, how are they going to do an oil change every week? Those are the people that can go 10,000 miles because this car is going to get started, driven for 8 hours at highway speed where the engine is relaxed. We don't have traffic, stop and go, then shut off, complete cool down, complete warm up again, drive 8 hours, shut off. That's how these folks are able to get that 10,000 mile oil change and not destroy their engine, because before you know it, they have 200,000-300,000 miles and they have no issues. But is that you and me? No, it's not. That's the problem. Whatever, if you're not the Toyota owner, you own another car, and this is all manufacturers, God bless them, but they are doing this for marketing purposes, whatever the case may be. Well, that's not our problem. Whatever the interval is, cut it in half. If you want to see that 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 miles without having major stuff, you're going to have to do stuff to the car. No car just with nothing lasts that much. Whatever the interval is, cut it in half. And please be on top of your car maintenance. If you don't do it yourself, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But be unaware, when does it need to happen? So we don't arrive at this point and we get this. This is really sad. I really feel bad for the owners of this car, because what happened to them is when it take us to the most important thing. Look, you got yourself into this situation. Although I don't see how somebody pays this much for this car. Cars are not cheap. Cars are not cheap anymore. You pay this much for this car and then you completely neglect it. Not go 12,000 miles. You go 46,000 miles. Oh, I forgot the oil change. But then you turn around and sell the car. without disclosing what's actually going on. I don't know if it was the original owner, maybe they traded it in a dealership, and dealership sent it to auction and somebody else bought it and sold it and they didn't even know, although I don't know how you could not know. When you start this car, it just knocks and sounds horrible and it smokes out of the exhaust. But anyways, don't sell a car with problems that you caused or even you did not cause and just say there's nothing wrong with it. That is so wrong, because if you do that, it will come back to you. Not today. People will not find you, but there's going to be a day you'll be standing in front of the Lord and He'll remind you of it. Don't do that. It's not worth it, folks. You damage your car, take the loss and disclose it and move on with your life. Life doesn't end with money and profit and loss. Your conscience is what starts and ends your life. That's the most important thing, folks. I really feel bad for the very nice couple that owned this car, that they just bought it. It has 66,000 miles. They thought they were doing the right thing. We researched. This is a good model. We bought it. We paid premium for it because it's a Lexus. Doesn't have a lot of miles, 2017 and all that. And here we are. This bill is not cheap, folks. These engines, they're very expensive, because if we were going to build them a new engine, this would almost total this entire car, because just this block is 5,000-6,000, and then the head, and then everything else, and there is millions of little pieces of this engine that cost a small fortune. Don't do this to yourself, number one. Number two, don't do it to others. Take care of your car, change that oil. It's very simple. It's cheapest maintenance in a car. You will never see this. And the second thing, if you did see this, disclose it. That's very important. Please, let us shake hands on this, and let's not do this to others or ourselves, starting with ourselves. Now, before I wrap up the video, I want to show you the little detour that we had here. So one of the head bolts, and I want to say this, probably every 20-25 engines that I've done, one of them has done this to me. See this? The head bolts. Toyota loves to use a 10mm triple square head bolt. Let me find that socket and I'll show you that socket. This is how that socket looks like. Socket's seen thousands of engines, I think. I think it's time perhaps to replace it. But it worked on all of them. This just goes in here. You gotta make sure it's seated all the way. And it takes the head bolt. There's another size, I believe it's an 8mm, same thing. For like 1NZ and those engines. Every 20-25 engines, we'll get one that strips the bolt, and then this has to happen. This is not fun. Now, when it happens on an engine that we have to potentially service the head and put it back in use, it's a disaster, because you have to drill through the bolt of the head until you release the tension, which is very dangerous because these are stretch bolts, and then slowly try to tap it to turn the bolt and get it going. But the good thing is, the cylinder head, I didn't have to do that. So this was payback for all the motors that made me spend 3-4 hours to get this bolt without any damage. We just poked a hole here and spun it. Very simple. Still took a while, but we got it. So this was payback for all these motors that made me spend hours and hours. Folks, I hope I don't get to see this again in one of your cars. And I hope I don't get to hear another sad story of somebody just bought a car, put their family's financial health in jeopardy, bought a car, hope they got a good deal, and here we are. I hope I don't get to see that again. It really breaks my heart, folks. Take care of your cars. Disclose what's wrong with them if you didn't, or if you just got unfortunate. Don't pass your misfortune to others. Disclose it. It's not worth it. And before I wrap up the video, here's a small shot of the used motor and used turbo that we ended up putting in this car. My opinion on used engines, I generally don't like them. Certain cars I'll never put a used engine in. This particular one, this engine does not have a lot of known issues. They do burn oil if you don't take care of them, but they haven't been around too long for them to develop this. The engine we got for this car, I handpicked. I'm very fussy about used engines. We picked one from a 2021 NX. It's the same engine, 8AR. It had 14,000 miles, and I was able to verify it, and usually I look at the service history, see if they maintained this car. This car was driven by, I imagine, an older couple. I mean, it had oil changes every 6 months. And the miles sometimes very inconsistent, like very low, like almost it's not due for an oil change. But they did it, I'm assuming, because they didn't drive it much. That's why. The turbo came from a different car. I believe it had 24,000 miles, something like that. Don't quote me on that if you're the owner of the car. But that's how I shop for used engines. You can get the VIN number, research it, see the service history, run kind of a full search on the VIN, see if I like it. Any car has been hit in the front, that's how used engines come from. Any car has been hit in the front, no, because the engine could be damaged and we're going back and forth. I usually buy the best warranty I can on them, so we pass it down to the owners that in case there's any issues. Like I'll give you an example of issues. We put an engine on an 08 4Runner. Car had over 300,000 miles, owner loves it. Put the engine had 90,000 miles or something around there. Runs great, we're really happy with it. Car leaves, a few months later, comes back for an AC problem. We're looking into it. I lift the car, we're just giving it one glance over. There's an external coolant leak from the head gasket. We're not gonna let that fly again. So this same thing applies to mechanics. I could have just turned the other eye and pretend it's not there until the warranty runs out and get another job for the shop, right? No, because I'm not going to be able to sleep at night, and that's not the right thing. I don't want other people to turn around and do that to me. So I told the owner, hey, the head gasket is leaking. We're not going to go and replace this motor that we hand-picked. It runs great. It just has an external coolant leak. It was a giant fight with the warranty company from the company that sold us the engine to actually get us to go into this motor and just replace the head gaskets. They just wanted to send us another engine. They don't care. It's cheaper for them that way. A lot of fighting, but we got it. That's the problem with used engines, folks, is you got to have a shop that is willing to fight your fights with these companies. And you supply your own engine, bring it to me. It's a very dangerous proposition because I'm going to put it in the car. And if it doesn't start, that's on you, because you brought the engine. All I can do is pull spark plugs, sometimes run a compression test, although it's not very accurate, look inside of a borescope, research some service history, if we have a VIN number on it, if the tag is still there, that's all I can do. Until you put it in the car, run it, and really drive it for a while, you won't know everything about it. So that's the problem with supplying engines to shops. So folks, this car is done. We're happy with this job. I hope they don't have any issues in the future. If they do have a warranty on the engine, so we'll take care of them there. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you. And you have yourself a wonderful day.